Terror en Estados Unidos.
Terror in the United States. Today, Russian President Vladimir Putin publicly unveiled the eternal missile Burevestnik, which in Spanish means storm bird. It is one of the superweapons announced by Putin in 2018 in response to the growing threats stemming from NATO's expansion toward the Russian border. The eternal Burevestnik missile is powered by a nuclear reactor. Yes, indeed, the Burevestnik missile not only has nuclear capability in the sense of carrying a nuclear warhead, but above all, it is powered by a nuclear reactor, giving it virtually unlimited eternal range and autonomy, something completely unprecedented in the military field to this day. Western leaders, and especially US President Donald Trump, appear terrified.
Aparecen aterrorizados. Muy buenas noches, muy buenas tardes y muy...
Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. From Buenos Aires, Argentina, we begin broadcast number 283 of Demolishing Myths Talks. A somewhat bumpy broadcast, indeed, due to the time change in the European continent just a few hours ago, early this morning. That caused a misunderstanding in communication. My fault, my mistake. I'm currently in Buenos Aires, which is why we're starting later than announced, and still without Fernando, for whom this broadcast actually starts at 9 o'clock. Until yesterday it was 8, but now it's 9. My apologies, demolishers. As soon as Fernando connects, in about 15 minutes, he'll appear here and join us. In the meantime, we're about to introduce the topic, and in fact, we wanted to present today's speech by Putin with this announcement, the public announcement of this weapon, this super weapon, as they call it in Russia. So we're not going to waste any time at all. By the way, before we begin, a few announcements. Here in Argentina, the midterm elections, the national legislative elections, are taking place today, which in my opinion, will mark the beginning of the end of the Milei experiment. We've already participated today with our vote. We'll present this immediately after the matter of the public announcement, the public presentation of the eternal Burevestnik missile. But we're also going to present this in much greater detail, in about 2.5 hours, in a simultaneous broadcast between our channel Demoliendo Mitos and the channel of our friend Jesus López Almejo, the international relations professor. That broadcast will be focused exclusively on the elections, and by the way, it'll take place right after the polls close, so we'll already be able to show some results and analysis of what's coming next. So anyone who wants to join us can do so now and also later on. Extra work this Sunday for this humble servant, but, well, this is our passion, so we're happy to be here with you. That said, demolishers, let's begin with Putin's speech, or rather, Putin's meeting with the high command of his armed forces. Today, in what they call, in military terms, a disclosed facility, presumably in some bunker in Russia. The participants included, naturally, Russian President Vladimir Putin and the Chief of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces, Valery Gerasimov, as well as the top commanders of the various branches of the Russian Armed Forces. The meeting began as follows. We present it here with the translation in front of me. Well, Putin begins during today's meeting. We will analyze the current situation in the area of special military operations, and in certain directions, and we will hear reports from the commanders of the force groups on their performance.
De los comandantes de los grupos de fuerzas sobre su desempeño. Esta semana las Fuerzas Armadas rusas también realizaron.
This week, the Russian armed forces also carried out strategic force exercises. We actually presented it here last Wednesday, during which the three pillars of Russia's strategic nuclear forces conducted training launches and tested new advanced weapons. Let's begin. These are Putin's words at the start, and from there the back and forth with General Gerasimov begins. On this topic, when Fernando joins us, I want to have an in-depth conversation with him about Gerasimov's figure, because of this man's two sides. On one hand, for many, even for the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces, he is a reference point in terms of military doctrine, something like a sage, a genius of military art, even for Russia's most important enemy in terms of direct confrontations at this moment.
De confrontaciones directas en este momento. El propio Sirski, lo recuerdo declarando en algún momento.
Sirski himself, I remember him saying at some point, stated that his mentor Gerasimov represented the highest exponent of military doctrine, and that he himself had developed the most modern aspects of contemporary military doctrine. Those were Sirski's words, who at this moment is the direct enemy. But even so, this man made military mistakes at the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, known by the Russians as the Special Military Operation. They made the mistake of underestimating the Ukrainian forces at the start of the direct confrontation. That is why there is this contradiction in Gerasimov's figure. On one hand, a military genius, and on the other, the one responsible for Russia's early mistakes. This is undeniable. They began a military operation with far fewer resources than necessary.
Operación militar con muchos menos recursos de los necesarios. Puede que el error no lo haya cometido Gerasimov.
It may not have been Gerasimov who made the mistake. It may have been Putin who made it in a political miscalculation. It could also have been the war minister at the time, who was later replaced. But the mistake was made. There's no doubt about that. Then naturally Russia corrected course and adopted a war of attrition strategy. And when it began, when it activated the Russian war machine, well, from that point on, the rivals disappeared. That's why Russia appears to be winning this war, not only against Ukraine, but also against all of NATO. But the initial mistakes were real as well. So we're going to deliberate on this with Fernando in a few minutes. That's all. In the meantime, back to our topic, and sorry for this digression, we present Putin's remarks immediately after Gerasimov's report on the current situation at the front. By the way, there have been Russian advances in recent days, crucial due to the creation of an operational encirclement in Pokrovsk, with at least one entire Ukrainian brigade trapped, and practically with no way out. Well, here we go. Now Putin begins his address. Regarding the exercises of the strategic offensive forces, these are Putin's words, we have once again demonstrated the strength of the Russian nuclear shield. There, perhaps, a little nicer. Now, yes. We have once again demonstrated the robustness of the Russian nuclear shield. The strategic forces are capable of ensuring the complete security of Russia and the Union state. We have already discussed this, and it is well known to all military experts that our armed forces are modern. Our nuclear forces are at the most advanced level. It is no exaggeration to say that they surpass those of all other nuclear states. As for the test we conducted, I would like to ask the Chief of the General Staff to report on one more event, which I mentioned in my inaugural address. It concerns, attention drumroll, the tests of the Burevestnik nuclear missile with unlimited range. I have a report from the defense industry and am aware of the Ministry of Defense's assessments. It's a unique product that no other country possesses. Moreover, I remember very well that when we announced the development of a weapon of this kind, highly qualified specialists and experts said that yes, it was a good goal, but also that it was unattainable in the short term. That's what the highly qualified specialists said. Now the final tests have been completed. There's still a lot of work to do before we can, put this weapon into combat service. That's clear. All the regulations need to be implemented. But still, as far as I understand, the key tasks have already been accomplished, and I'd like to hear the opinion of the Chief of the General Staff, Valery Gerasimov. These are Putin's words about, well, Putin's face, that little smile. For those of us who have been following Putin's speeches for a long time, generally, remember the meme, right?
Hace mucho tiempo, por lo general, recuerden el meme, ¿no? De Putin feliz, Putin triste, Putin enojado.
Putin happy, Putin sad, Putin angry, Putin smiling, and always in the meme, the same poker face of Putin. Well, that little smile just now says it all. The Russian president's satisfaction with the development of this weapon. And now he's about to start a back and forth with Gerasimov on this topic. By the way, what's behind the development of this weapon? According to a Western military analyst we saw today, we'll introduce him shortly, he described it in a dismissive but, in a sense, accurate way. He called it an exotic weapon. This American military analyst, a former major in the armed forces, indeed considers it an exotic weapon. It marks a before and after. This missile can remain in the air indefinitely.
En el aire indefinidamente. ¿Sí? No solamente puede realizar un ataque.
Not only can it carry out a direct attack against the United States, covering the roughly 14,000 kilometers considered necessary for an attack from Russia to the United States, the range of an intercontinental ballistic missile, but, on the contrary, it can make circumnavigations, orbits around the Earth almost indefinitely, until it determines a target and strikes it directly. This represents a turning point, and indeed, in that sense, we can describe this weapon as an exotic weapon, as a rarity. And of course, the development of this and other Russian weapons, known in Russia as super weapons. I'm going to take a short pause here before presenting the exchange between Gerasimov and Putin at that same meeting.
Gerasimov y Putin en esa misma reunión. Por cierto, este desarrollo no comenzó.
By the way, this development did not begin as a Russian initiative. Above all, the development of the so-called 7 Russian superweapons did not arise out of a love for militarism. Far from it. It came after NATO's, and especially the United States, tireless, continuous, and repeated rejection of Russia's multiple proposals to establish military agreements. At one point, the first Putin, enthusiastic about the possibility of a peaceful world after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and the end of actually existing socialism in the USSR and its transformation into Russia, that Putin and that Russia, remember, wanted to join NATO. That would have created a security agreement with everyone included, and therefore without the possibility of expansionist moves toward Russia. Because, of course, Russia itself would have been part of that military umbrella. But over the years, it was the Americans and the NATO members who rejected this Russian attempt at rapprochement. First, they rejected it with a simple no to that membership, and later, directly, with NATO's expansion ever closer to Russia's borders, along with the corresponding deployment of troops and missiles in all those nations that joined after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet bloc. And NATO's latest provocation began with the decision to create a so-called defensive missile shield, known as Aegis, whose main missile bases are in Romania and Poland. Defensive shield, in quotation marks, because remember that these systems can easily be converted, with a simple switch, from defensive missiles to offensive ones, right? The technology and logic of these missiles are the same, and their range naturally means that a missile launched from Poland or Romania would represent a substantial threat due to those countries' proximity to Russia. Well, as a consequence of all this,
Bueno, como consecuencia de todo esto, de hecho, recuerdo que los rusos también inocentes.
In fact, I remember that the Russians also, innocently, wanted to take part in this missile shield. When they started pushing this madness, above all Bush Jr., the Russians responded, oh, right, sorry, the Russians initially responded with a warning. But how? If we supposedly appear as allies, with no conflicts between us, and we've already abandoned actually existing socialism, then what need is there for you? NATO, the United States, and Europe. to create something as aggressive as a missile system around us. And the Americans replied, at that time under Bush's command, "Oh no, no, dear Putin."
Comandados por Bush, no, querido Putin. En realidad, el escudo defensivo de misiles...
In reality, the defensive missile shield around Russia doesn't seem to be aimed at Russia, but rather responds to the possibility of an attack from Iran. And that's when the Russians reacted quickly. Oh well, if you want to build a missile shield against Iran, we can take part too. Of course, that way they neutralized the issue, because if Russia participated in that defensive shield, it would no longer be at risk, given their knowledge of the weapons, the bases, and even the possible deployment of missiles operated by Russian military personnel. Defensive Aegis missiles, part of that highly controversial Aegis defense system. Well, controversial, not really. This was a militaristic and expansionist move by NATO. Nothing controversial about it. The intention was crystal clear.
De la OTAN, de polémica nada, clarísima la intención. Bueno, cuando los rusos reaccionaron de esta manera...
Well, when the Russians reacted that way, Bush responded, "Oh no, the shield is meant for the Iranians, but you can't take part." And interestingly, the missile shield didn't appear around Iran, but around Russia. Well, for Putin, that marked the "this is it." Enough. For nearly 20 years we sought rapprochement with the West, peace, military cooperation. And not only were those efforts rejected, but political actions were taken, openly expansionist and extremely dangerous for Russia, such as NATO's expansion and the placement of missiles and military bases in countries increasingly closer to its border. So, the Russians drew a red line.
Entonces los rusos establecieron una línea roja. Por un lado, ni Ucrania ni Georgia. Esto querían en 2000.
On one hand, neither Ukraine nor Georgia wanted this in 2008, at the Bucharest summit, in 2007 or 2008. It was Bush Jr., the younger Bush, the foolish Bush, who wanted it. And on top of all that, Putin later decided, well, if you're going to create this threat to Russia, then from now on, after so many years of failed negotiations due to the West's lack of will, we're going to create our own form of defense and develop unstoppable superweapons for the United States and for Europe. And so they began developing superweapons. I remember the reactions of Western military analysts, sardonic, mocking, laughing. What nonsense! This superweapon idea! Russia will never be able to create weapons like that.
Rusia jamás podrá generar armas de este tipo. Claro, por entonces Putin no presentaba.
Of course, at that time, Putin wasn't publicly presenting information about these projects. But from that moment on, developments began that today, in some cases, are already known to all of us and have been implemented militarily, used in Ukraine. For example, the Kinzhal hypersonic missile, the same with the Zircon missile. The Zircon missile is a hypersonic cruise missile. The Kinzhal missile, a semi-ballistic air-to-ground hypersonic missile. And this one was never really shown, but there are all the signs of its definite existence. There's also the unmanned underwater attack vehicle, as they call it, a kind of torpedo known as Poseidon.
Una especie de torpedo conocido como Poseidón. Esto sí, está entre este Poseidón y el...
This, yes, is between this Poseidon and, by the way, the Burevestnik. The most extraordinary, the most exotic examples of these superweapons appear. The Poseidon torpedo would basically generate such a terrible underwater nuclear explosion that it would trigger a tsunami and essentially total flooding. For example, the United Kingdom would disappear underwater. That's the level of power of this science fiction-like weapon. Another of the superweapons announced. All of them in the 2018 State of the Nation address. That's when Putin declared, well guys, that's enough, at least publicly. Obviously, the development of this had already begun a few years earlier, but that was when these superweapons were announced, though only by name. And from then on, between the war in Ukraine and the increasingly blatant threats from the West toward Russia, these superweapons began to be unveiled one by one. The avant-garde as well, an irregular trajectory, hypersonic re-entry vehicle with multiple nuclear warheads. This is the only hypersonic intercontinental ballistic missile tested so far.
probado hasta el momento. Los chinos también generaron uno, pero bueno, más allá de las pruebas...
The Chinese also developed one, but well, beyond the tests shown a few days ago there, inside China for the moment we have no more information than those images they released. So the Zircon, the Kinzhal, the Poseidon, the Avangard, the Sarmat, another intercontinental ballistic missile equipped with multiple nuclear warheads and also logically hypersonic, and this one is super heavy. And finally, 6 so far. Sarmat, Poseidon, Kinzhal, Zircon, Avangard, and Burevestnik. I would add, there are 6. Ah, right, that's why, there are 6. I would add the Armia, logically, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yes, with the Armia, 7, indeed. Well, the Armia also shown in battle. And now, nothing more and nothing less than this.
Nada más y nada menos que esto, la presentación del Burevestnik.
The presentation of the Burevestnik, Stormbird. Although in fact the literal translation of Burevestnik isn't Stormbird, but rather the specific name of this bird is Burevestnik. Just a second, I want the exact translation. I'm quite obsessive about these things, by the way. Here it is, the name in Spanish, Storm Petrel. That's the name of a little bird. The Russians have this habit, almost a quirk, of naming their missiles after native flowers or animals. Meanwhile, you can hear the sound of our friend Fernando connecting. By the way, Storm Petrel is the meaning of Burevestnik, this little bird here. Honestly, I had never in my life heard the word paíño or petrel. Maybe in Spain, since it's a European bird, the name is more familiar. But around here...
Por aquí.
Aquí estoy.
Querido Fernando.
The time change has played a dirty trick on us, and this is also the European Union's fault. Damn yes, folks, this is also the European Union's fault. Every year, all together, all in unison, like Fuente Ovejuna, changing the clocks. Well, it's their fault too. That said, good afternoon, good evening, good morning. And sorry about these things, but they really get on my nerves. I'm on fire today, huh? I'm saying it up front. In fact, I'm announcing that we're going to launch a new segment. This will be a surprise. A new segment we're going to call How to Learn to Be Poor in All Earnestness.
¿Cómo aprender a ser pobres de solemnidad? Es decir, que es fundamentalmente dirigida a los europeos.
That is to say, it is fundamentally aimed at Europeans. So we'll be explaining ways to make a living. For example, in this first episode, very briefly, so you can see what this new section is about, what kind of future it has, how promising it is. We're all overwhelmed by artificial intelligence, which is going to leave us without jobs. Well, it's going to put, for example, lawyers out of work, supermarket cashiers too. Will it affect us? Won't it affect us? Well, there's one job that artificial intelligence will take a very long time to replace. Botched repairs, DIY. Let's see, since we won't have any money, we'll be impoverished, calling an electrician or grabbing a stool, a chair. Today, one of my chair legs broke. Before, I'd just throw it away and buy another one. Not anymore, since we won't have money. We'll have to fix it in a sloppy way. So DIY courses are going to become, well, you know. Being a DIY instructor will have an extraordinary future, because we'll have to fix everything ourselves. We won't have money to pay for anything. I'm being very serious, even if I sound like I'm joking. But in the end, calling the electrician, the plumber, using things, changing cars every 5 years, well, we won't be changing cars because, and I'm saying this now, remember what Mr. Fernando Moragón said, in the next decade, the car, whether electric, gas, or nuclear, will be a luxury item. So we won't have cars, you'll see. All right, dear Fernando, we were introducing, but come on. I thought this was a geopolitics show, and I see it's an ornithology show with a bunch of little birds.
Exactly. What's this about? Well, this comes from the Russians' odd habit of naming their weapons after little flowers. The most terrible weapons, with names of flowers, trees, and little birds. That's why we were just showing a bit about the Russian superweapons. And just recently, Putin's meeting with his commander-in-chief of the armed forces, Valery Gerasimov, and the Russian Joint General Staff, with the announcement of the Burevestnik missile. Once again, by the way, named Storm Petrel, that little bird.
De tormenta o petrel tormentoso, este pajarito, y ahora va a comenzar.
And now it's about to begin. We're introducing it here. Now, yes, a back and forth is about to start in this. And I say just a small thing. Couldn't the Russians call him a cruel killer, as is usually done with these things?
Beyond the joke, Fernando, there's a very interesting issue here about the cultural difference between Americans, or Westerners, the Anglo world, this thing of calling it storm shadow.
Shock and awe and stuff like that.
Of course, attack shadow, that storm shadow, may be the literal translation, or attack mess, right? Like missiles.
Yes, an operation. I don't remember which one of those. I don't know if it was the one in Iraq. The operational part is called something like shock and awe. What do you say? Let's see. No, the Russians use technical terms, special military operation, which is a bland thing.
Lastly, well, one of these superweapons was called Aryashnik, basically hazel, the hazelnut tree. They call the missiles geraniums. Sorry, they call the drones geraniums. Well, that's interesting. But beyond that, we present the second part of today's meeting from a bunker, with the back and forth now about this missile between Putin and Gerasimov. This way, if you'll come with me, now yes. Well, this is the moment, and here Putin begins a televised dialogue with Gerasimov. The following: there is still a lot of work to be done to put this weapon into combat service. That's clear. It's necessary to implement all the regulations, but nevertheless, as far as I understand, the key tasks have already been completed, and I would like to hear the opinion of the Chief of the General Staff. And that's where Gerasimov begins. Supreme Commander, this test was carried out on October 21st. In fact, it differed from previous tests in that the missile flew for many hours, covering a distance of 14,000 kilometers. And that's not the limit, using nuclear power. The technical characteristics of the Burevestnik allow us to employ it with guaranteed precision against heavily protected targets at any distance. Moreover, during the test, the missile performed all the required vertical and horizontal maneuvers, thus demonstrating its high ability to evade missile and air defenses. And then comes Putin's question: how many kilometers? And Gerasimov replies once again, 14,000 kilometers.
14,000 kilómetros. Putin con otra pregunta. ¿Cuánto tiempo estuvo en el aire?
Putin with another question: how long was it in the air? Gerasimov replies in this back and forth: about 15 hours. And again Putin: isn't that the limit? Gerasimov replies: no. Now Putin again: we'll also have to decide what kind of weapon the new system belongs to. We need to determine its possible uses and start preparing the infrastructure to deploy this weapon in our armed forces. I'll do it, sir. A very military-style response. Well, and Putin toward the end. Now then, regarding the enemy surrounded in the areas you just reported on, because this conversation, this report from Gerasimov, had indeed begun with a briefing on the situation in Ukraine. There's no doubt that he will try to free his groups, those groups encircled in Pokrovsk, both from the outside and from within, as well as through activities in the neighboring areas. That's why I came, to hear the opinions of the group commanders, above all how they plan to organize the combat operations of the units entrusted to them in the near future, taking into account the current situation. Just right. Well, right. This with quite a bit of luck, because I, with no knowledge of Russian, am reading the translation along with Putin's words, but without understanding absolutely anything. Right.
Well, okay. I mean, let's stay calm. No need for such panic. Look, the first thing to say is that Gerasimov being a military man, marketing isn't really his thing. I mean, the guy is there giving his military report, all heavy and dull, one of those, and that was even a short one. And Putin telling him, Come on, we're being filmed, meaning this is being done for people to see. Give me some impressive numbers. So Putin has to ask him, what's the range, Gerasimov? Oh, well, this much. And how many hours? This many. Now I'll give the data. Well, you've probably already given them, but anyway. So the engine is a nuclear-powered turbojet with unlimited range. I mean, the test carried out here covered approximately 14,000 kilometers. But because otherwise it's not going to keep circling the Earth and then fall back into Russia. But yes, effectively unlimited. That is, since it's a nuclear propulsion engine, we don't really know how long. Obviously, like any nuclear-powered vehicle, whether a ship, a submarine, or now a missile, yes, it has a lifespan, but it's an extremely long one. We're talking about years, of course. In other words, it could keep circling for years like a fool. The missile, well, this has probably been mentioned too, is a cruise missile. Let's not forget that. This is important, and we'll see why in a moment. Its flight altitude ranges between 25 and 100 meters. And why does it fly so low? Well, we'll see why it flies so low in a moment. Look, here it is. This is everywhere right now. I mean, this is the talk of the day.
This, as a courtesy, Fernando, from the sister channel Wars and Geopolitics. Please, everyone subscribe to that channel. The latest information in Spanish on geopolitics and wars. Excellent, some of the best on Telegram. So everyone's invited.
Look how good this is. Before I even got into this, on this very channel I was watching Wars and Geopolitics, and they had already released several new pieces of information, in addition to what we're seeing here on the screen. It's also worth noting this. The propulsion is nuclear, but so is the warhead. I mean, the warhead is nuclear, which makes this especially concerning for its enemies, particularly the Americans. And here they explain about the Burevestnik. Why does it fly at such a low altitude? Well, as cruise missiles usually do, but first, radar invisibility. And as I'm reading literally, this is taken right now from Wars and Geopolitics, at that altitude, the flight path stays below the radar horizon. Which means that long-range radars can't detect it because of the Earth's curvature itself. In other words, this makes interception almost impossible until the moment of impact. Indeed, it can also evade, obviously. It flies at about 300 kilometers per hour, which means it can reach supersonic speeds, a bit above the speed of sound, but most of the time it flies subsonic, probably around 850. Flying so low allows it to evade anti-air defenses, the engagement zones of systems like the Patriot, NASAMS, and so on, which are optimized to shoot down higher altitude missiles, especially ballistic ones. Then follow the terrain. This is important, because what cruise missiles do, as you know, is follow the terrain, and the lower they fly, the better. And modern navigation systems make that practically perfect. Another thing, thermal camouflage. The closer to the ground, the more natural thermal interference there is. That is, the heat from the ground. The closer you are, the Earth's own radiation camouflages the missile and makes it hard to detect. And then, from what little we know, because obviously a lot of data has been released, the Burevestnik, from what is known, is a cruise missile with a nuclear-powered ramjet engine. Low-altitude flight helps maintain stable subsonic speed and allows the fuselage to expand with the airflow. This would be a kind of scramjet or something similar, which takes in air at low altitude, channels it inside, and uses it to cool, according to the diagram we have here, the nuclear reactor. And to propel it, a few more details have leaked out. And well, another fundamental thing. Remember, I mentioned this last Friday. The difference between what's said publicly, especially by Trump, who keeps talking, and what's really going on behind the scenes or visible in the background. That's why we find out about some things. And I was saying, while Trump is out there, whether it's tomahawk yes, tomahawk no, whether we meet in Hungary and Budapest, whether we don't meet, whether we postpone it, yes, no, wasting time. Although there's also an element of pressure. We can come back to it later. But we were saying that in the meantime, everyone's very angry and all that, all theater, pure theater. We have one of Putin's negotiators, Kirill Dmitriev, who, while Trump was out there saying nonsense, was actually negotiating economic issues with the Americans.
We're presenting it, Fernando. We're presenting it right now.
But you have the latest statements. Ah, yes, here.
The statements and the specific words. Well, several things were said in this speech, in this statement. The most important thing for us is the following. By the way, he not only accompanies Putin as an advisor, but also appears to be in charge of one of Russia's most important public investment funds. So if this man at some point... Exactly. This man determines where Russia directs its political and geopolitical efforts, but also its economic and geo-economic ones. One moment. Here's the translation. Yes, now. Well, here, Kirill Dmitriev, Russian presidential advisor. We have already shared with our American colleagues information about President Putin's meeting with the general staff this morning. The meeting just shown here. The president was informed that 5,000 Ukrainian soldiers are surrounded in the Kupiansk area and 5,500 in the Krasnoyarsk area, according to the Russian version. He was also informed, President Trump, of the successful test of a new missile, the Burabesnik, with a nuclear warhead. It is crucial that this information be conveyed directly to the leaders and key figures of the US president's administration. We also communicated with representatives of the American community who are open to a positive dialogue with Russia. This video was possibly made after returning to Russia, although until just a few days ago, this man was in the United States. A bit more. Yesterday, we met with Congresswoman Anna Luna, a Republican congresswoman, by the way. She expressed her support for dialogue with Russia and her gratitude for Russia's publication of the Kennedy files. This has received a very positive response from the American public. He also confirmed his desire to hold a meeting between US congressmen and the Russian State Duma, which will be organized soon and will constitute an important dialogue between the parliaments of our countries. Consequently, all our discussions are being conducted with the utmost seriousness at this critical moment. We are committed to a constructive dialogue and to clearly presenting Russia's position on numerous issues. Russia wants a peaceful solution, of course, but respect for all its interests and the elimination of the root causes of the Ukrainian crisis are the foundation for making the right decisions. Fernando, your analysis of these words. We want peace, but we... Translation.
Traducción. Vamos a traducirlo.
Let's translate it. Let's put it into plain language. This is, first of all, trolling, and on top of that, it's a slap in response to the slap Trump gave him. Trump says, well, look, I'm sanctioning your companies. And as Putin himself admitted, Rosneft and Lukoil, his oil companies with their more than 30 subsidiaries scattered around the world, as Putin himself admitted, this obviously hurts us. It's another thing whether we're going to go bankrupt, but let's not kid ourselves. It doesn't exactly do us any good. In other words, let's call things what they are. Putin himself said it. Even though he later tried to downplay it, he had to admit that this doesn't exactly benefit Russia. Well, this is the response. That is, look, just so you know, we've just tested the Burevestnik. This one, or I still haven't learned it properly. Burevestnik. Let's see how it's pronounced. It's in Russian. But anyway, I'll ask later. Burevestnik. Burevestnik with the accent at the end.
Burevestnik. Con el acento al final.
Well, I'll ask later, those who know Russian.
¿Algún ruso por ahí que nos esté viendo?
Any Russians out there watching us? I mean, Burevestnik, let's leave it at that for now. A hard hit. I mean, look, I'm saying this in case you still have the ability to mess around with the tomahawks or their equivalents, or mainly because, and this is what matters, we know perfectly well that there's no need to use the tomahawks. You're directing long-range Ukrainian drones against our energy systems and causing us a lot of damage. And I can assure you they're taking quite a hit, because Russian sources have confirmed it to me, as they say. That's why I told them don't go down that path, because things will go badly if you keep going that way. And besides, we have a missile that's practically ready. When these announcements are made, when it's made public that we've carried out this test and it went well, it means the thing is practically done. One of the things I read a little while ago was precisely that it seems he has already given the order to the military complex to Gerasimov and company to complete the final certifications, tests, and so on, and that next year missile production will begin. Well, what he's doing here is telling them, look, and also I'm telling you, in case you still haven't realized, so you can tell the Europeans, well, the Democrats, we have 5,000 Ukrainians trapped in Kupiansk, in the Kupiansk pocket, and another 5,000 in the one at Pokrovsk. You see, we've told them two things, basically that they can surrender, and in that case, that's why Putin says what he says, we'll be merciful and won't kill them. However, if they don't surrender, not a single one will be left. And on top of that, we're going to boast about the fall of Pokrovsk, which is key. Of all the places that are currently close to falling, the most important one from my point of view is Pokrovsk, without a doubt. That is to say, it's not that those other places aren't important, but Pokrovsk is the key, because the moment it falls, it means the expansion of Russian troops to the west and north. And that's a disaster. That's why when I said that Pokrovsk would fall in August, it didn't. Because the Ukrainians threw in everything they could, reserves, everything they had. That's why there are 5,000 people there, which is quite a lot. And for an area that isn't very large and of which the Russians have already taken, let's not forget in Pokrovsk, half the city. And they were entering both from the north and from the south of Mirnograd, the neighboring city. Therefore, as I said, this is a significant amount and a disaster that already has consequences. And it's not over yet. Sirki has already had to come out because he was pressured by parliamentarians who support Poroshenko. Sirki had to come out saying, no, well, it's the fault of the mid-level commanders and some generals who don't pass on accurate information. And then they say, well, no, we've retaken such and such a village. We've retaken such and such a town. And it turns out they haven't retaken anything. And now I find out that this has happened. In other words, it's a justification, because he sees that the disaster is inevitable and has to blame others. So it's already having consequences. Another important thing, the famous Blue Battalion, or the regiment that was around there, received the order to re-enter the encircled or nearly encircled area, and they said they were going to talk.
Speaking of the situation at the front, we'll present it after this. Don't drop the topic of the missiles and the message to the United States.
The message to the United States is to say, look, I don't know, I mean, it's all well and good for Trump to go around acting tough and saying, no, we have the best weapons in the world. That's fine by me. But the reality is very different. Our weapons are immensely better. You don't have anything like what we have. You don't have hypersonic missiles. That is, you don't have Kinzhal. You don't have, what's the name of the naval one? I can't remember right now. Well, I'll remember in a moment. The Zircon? The Zircon. You don't have the Poseidon. The Poseidons are a kind of large torpedo that's built into a special submarine already operational, and they can do several things, but they're mainly designed to be launched against the United States, either on its Pacific or Atlantic coast, and cause a gigantic tsunami. They're nuclear missiles. They would explode before reaching the ground and wipe out the entire coast, east or west, depending on where they're launched from, in the United States. But they have more. I mean, we saw the other day, well, not long ago, they were once again showing, because they've been operating for a while now. But anyway, they were presenting again the missiles, well, sorry, those lasers used to shoot down drones, which also have a specific name. In other words, they're already operational on the same battlefield in Ukraine.
It's that they have more. They have the perisvets, if I remember correctly.
That's right, perisvet, that's right. They have the Armada, meaning the most powerful intercontinental missiles in the world, with avant-garde warheads that reach speeds of at least Mach 20, 20 times the speed of sound. The technological lag of the United States right now in the field of nuclear missiles or in weaponry in general is staggering. And serious experts acknowledge this, not Trump's bootlickers and company. In other words, the lag is enormous, and in the nuclear field, it's tremendous. That's why they're coming back, having been notified and told, look, if you keep going down this path and at this pace, you're going to have problems. Here we probably have the Poseidon, which is huge. I mean, Fernando,
Fernando, una pregunta dentro de la pregunta, a propósito.
Question within the question regarding the mention of Gerasimov. Here Gerasimov, precisely in today's announcement, completely agreeing with your characterization. In fact, in some memes, he's jokingly portrayed as Droopy, because he resembles Droopy, that cartoon character, with Droopy's face, right? Instead of a Marshall face, this Droopy over here, at least here in Latin America. Also the expression, this Droopy, right?
Also, Gerasimov's expression is always the same. I mean, you see him like that.
That's how the man is. Exactly. Now, beyond the joke, the question is this, Fernando. On one hand, presumably Gerasimov made a military mistake at the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, of the so-called special military operation, by underestimating the Ukrainian forces already equipped and trained by NATO. That's why Russia began the special military operation with between 100,000 and 250,000 troops. This is debatable. No one can determine it with certainty. But far fewer than the maximum number of troops possible for a war against Ukrainian armed forces, with many more troops than that. And that's why they couldn't, maybe by a small margin, but they couldn't achieve the goal of generating pressure or even Zelensky's fall, a negotiation, and then a withdrawal. That's what they wanted, but they couldn't. A military mistake. Now, on the other hand, Zaluzhny himself, the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces, describes Gerasimov as a genius of military doctrine. He calls him my teacher. And he was in the Soviet school. Many even present him as a military genius beyond Russia. So, which one is it, Fernando? The one who made the mistake, the genius, Droopy, a galactic hawk? Which one of them all, Fernando, is Gerasimov?
What we know in theory, more or less, exactly what you pointed out. That is the start of the special military operation, or the design of the special military operation. Later changes, although it keeps the same name, it becomes something completely different. In other words, it has nothing to do with it. The design is a mess. Honestly, I could plan a better operation myself. And look, I don't even know much about these things. And this, I'll say it again, was confirmed to me by absolutely reliable Russian sources who obviously don't say this in public. It was a huge screw-up. I mean, monumental. At the time, what became known was that there were basically two options: to carry out a general operation like the one they did, or a local operation limited to what would be the Donbass, Luhansk, and Donetsk. This became public later. So where's the problem here? I mean, who is responsible for the disaster? Because this disaster cost an enormous number of Russian lives. Well, there are many responsible parties, among them the general, I don't remember his name, in charge of logistics, who was corrupt, and ended up in prison later, of course, when the current minister Belousov arrived. Well, since a Russian army that has, or had, it doesn't have it anymore, even less so now, that is, it had the same problem the Ukrainians still have. You can't give bad news to the high command or to your superiors. So if the high command asks you, everything's fine, even if you're being defeated and men are dying. No. And this comes from the Soviet era, meaning the idea that you can't give bad news to your superiors, just like that. This creates huge misinformation problems in the chain of command. Of course, if they keep telling you everything's fine, that there are no problems, that everything's okay, fine. Well, that day, from the generals in charge of preparing the operation to the top military authority, which is Gerasimov, the chief of the general staff, to the Minister of Defense, who ultimately was the one who had to meet with all the military personnel and assess the situation, even though he wasn't a soldier. He brought in some military officers, and ultimately Putin. I mean, let's call things as they are. That's what being the head of the army means. The one who has to give the green light. And when they present it to him, because this isn't something they just hand you. Look, in an operation of this scale, they don't present you with one plan, one option. They present several. In the end, depending on the recommendations you get or not, it's the head of state who has to decide. Well, this was a huge screw-up, and from there were probably shared responsibilities, each in their own role, in their own sphere. The problem is that they wanted to play like the Americans, bluffing. Look, Americans are very good at poker, but Russians are terrible at poker. They're great at chess, sorry, but poker isn't their thing. Chess is their game. And the Chinese, don't even get me started. They're also terrible at poker, but their game is more complex than chess. It's Go. I mean, as we know, after they had already beaten the world chess champions, it took them many years to beat any Go champion, because Go is much more complex than chess. That said, they tried to play poker.
Poker is basically based on lying.
Of course.
And chess and Go are based on strategic planning and rationality.
Yes, that's why I'm saying it. So that's why we see Trump, who really goes overboard, showing his true colors and bluffing every day, left and right. I mean, the Russians don't do that kind of thing. They tried to bluff about budgets that were fake. I mean, one, that the army, and that's an intelligence problem, and Russian sources actually admitted that to me. Intelligence, which is key to any operation, really messed things up. I mean, honestly, I'm saying this here, but well, it could cost me dearly. They've shot me down in the Kremlin. But anyway, said here, I mean, they admitted to me or told me that the secret services, both military and non-military, were deeply infiltrated by the Americans and knew everything. They had spies even under Putin's bed. It's understood that this was later dismantled, at least partially. So the Americans had found out everything the Russians were going to do. A mistake, really, a huge problem. Second, their assessment of Ukrainian capabilities and forces in every respect, both in military capabilities, that is weaponry and training, and in motivation. Because what the Russians believed was that they would arrive and, as soon as the first Russian tanks appeared, the Ukrainian army would run away? Well, no, they didn't. So second screw up. Another thing, I know the Russians have been saying this even, well, they justify it now after the fact. Well, I understand why they justify it. It's normal. No, we didn't want to take Kiev, or we withdrew from Kiev because talks were already underway and all that. No, they couldn't take Kiev. They couldn't. I mean, that's a lie. They simply couldn't take Kiev. As I said, Russian sources, they didn't have the capability to take it. And on top of that, they did it so badly, they had so many logistical problems that not even then, with terrible logistics stretching their lines in a deep operation, you'd have to be crazy, attacking at a disadvantage, meaning numerically. When every manual says that attackers need to have a 3-to-1 advantage, that is, for every defender, 3 attackers. And here it was the other way around. There were more defenders than attackers. This was madness and a blunder. At most, there were 120,000 Russians.
For 260,000. Fernando, how responsible is Gerasimov, and how much of it should be attributed instead to Shoigu, Putin, and perhaps other generals?
Well, the political side of it is obviously attributable mainly to Shoigu and Putin, and the military side to Gerasimov, who is the highest-ranking officer, because some things might slip past him. But the design of the operation shows that it was something improvised, done on the fly, not prepared in advance. That is, they expected that the Americans might back down when they saw 120,000 Russian soldiers conducting maneuvers on the border with Ukraine. The Americans said no, that they didn't care at all, and that's when they had to improvise that operation. And that's a political and military blunder by both of them. In other words, from that point on, and for that reason not for any other, because they were aware of that disaster, the Russians quickly tried to negotiate with the Ukrainians. First in the talks held in Belarus, I can't remember the city right now, but anyway, in Belarus, and then the ones that took place later in Turkey. And in the end, it was Boris Johnson who ruined it, because the Ukrainians also wanted to, since they weren't in a position to work miracles either, right? Well, because it wasn't sufficiently recognized that NATO's and the United States' strategy from the start was to push Russia into a war. Exactly that. And that was a miscalculation. From there, they started to redirect things. They led to the disaster that were the Ukrainian offensives. This was about striking blows here. The Ukrainian offensives of 2022. And from that point on, Putin had to do something he absolutely didn't want to do. Not in a million years. But he had no choice. The mobilization of the famous 300,000. So from there, well, things started to be redirected. There have been many changes since then. There's another thing Gerasimov should explain at some point, even if only in his memoirs. And that is why, when General Surovikin begins, after taking command, to bomb Ukraine's energy systems, especially the electrical substations, and starts to de-electrify Ukraine, why is he dismissed? And later, in January 2023, Gerasimov himself takes direct charge of military operations. That is, before he was the chief of the general staff, a man who was in Moscow. Well, he's still in Moscow now, he drops by from time to time. But let's say he was in charge of everything. Now, in addition to being in charge of everything, he's the visible head appointed to lead operations on the ground. That is to say, it's not just that they could delegate, as they did, which was another catastrophic mistake. They divided the front. Instead of having a centralized command, when they launched the special military operation, they had 3 heads. One in charge of the northern front, another of the center, to put it simply, and another of the south, with no one above them except those in Moscow at headquarters. Another disaster, if they even have one. And there Gerasimov has to explain why he stopped the de-electrification of Ukraine. But Fernando, no one understands it.
Pero Fernando, ¿eso lo determinó Gerasimov o lo determinó Putin?
Did Gerasimov decide that, or did Putin? It was, let's see, I think, can I make a defense of Gerasimov? All right, here we go. Well, first let me put it in context. I describe Putin as the greatest geostrategist in the world since World War II, without comparing him, of course, to a Stalin, a Roosevelt, or even someone like Hitler. A disastrous figure, but geostrategically quite skilled in many respects, though he certainly made mistakes. From that point on, for me, Putin is, at least in the last 50 years, one of the most lucid, one of the most brilliant as a statesman, regardless of anyone's opinion, whether they like him or not. The man is brilliant. That said, who should answer for having excessively delayed Russian military actions after 20 years of attempts to reach out to the West, and one slap in the face after another? Obviously. And, on the other hand, all the characteristics of the beginning of the Russian invasion somehow seem to point to an improvised decision, as if they didn't want this politically, until something apparently happened. The intensification of the bombings over Donetsk, roughly since early 2022. That leads to a hasty political decision, and to me that's when they call in Gerasimov. Gerasimov, we want a deep entry operation right now. Moreover, an operation outside the Soviet and later Russian military doctrine, the military doctrine managed by Gerasimov. They want an operation more in the NATO style, a strong, sudden entry, and after that, to generate negotiations. And Gerasimov makes a lot of mistakes there, indeed, but ultimately the decision was Putin's. And when both Putin and Gerasimov are starting a game that in Gerasimov's case looks much more like his area of expertise. The Soviet military doctrine of war of attrition, with lots of artillery, then lots of drones, with the reactivation or activation, the mobilization of the Soviet military-industrial complex, the mobilization of many more people. There they are truly in their element, and from that point on, they have no rival. But the one responsible for the mistakes, as well as the successes. And once again, I see Putin as a brilliant geostrategist, but everyone makes mistakes. One thing doesn't cancel out the other, is more Putin than Gerasimov, in my opinion.
Look, one thing doesn't cancel out the other. It's clear that Putin has had, let's say, an extraordinary number of successes. That doesn't mean he doesn't make mistakes from time to time. I mean, we can apply this to anyone, politicians or military leaders. In general, you can find some big blunder they've made. But yes, you're right. Ultimately, no matter what they present to you, the one who decides is the president, and the decision is political. Let's not forget that wars are always political, in the sense that the objectives are political, and the military is in charge of implementing the military measures to achieve those objectives. But the objectives are always political, everywhere, you know? I mean, this happens in any country. Well, Putin, I think, didn't expect several things. He has to act quickly and hastily, but he must have gotten desperate. I mean, because the Americans had already shown their hand, and Zelensky had already shown his hand at least throughout 2021. I mean, they played a card. In fact, look, this always happens. It happened in World War I, in World War II. It's especially clear in World War I when the generals and politicians of the time expected a war like those of the 19th century, like the Franco-Prussian War. Well, 2 or 3 battles in the field, one side wins, and that's it. And they found themselves facing something completely unexpected because they hadn't anticipated the revolution in weaponry. Well, the same thing happened here. Since World War II, Soviet doctrine was much more about deep attack. In fact, during the Cold War, what was expected, what both sides expected, was that the Soviets would supposedly launch an unstoppable deep offensive, at least as far as France. Germany was considered lost. It's a shame the Soviets didn't do that. I mean, sorry, I don't know what I was thinking. And what the Americans had to do, that's why they were interested in Spain as a rear base, was to be able to hold off the Soviets' NATO forces on the ground long enough for reinforcements to arrive in Spain and in places where they could be deployed. That was basically the idea. What they found, however, was that this didn't actually work.
Lo que se encuentran es que justamente esto no funciona. Este ataque en profundidad es un desastre.
This deep offensive is a disaster. And from there, they're going to find themselves in this kind of so-called World War I, in quotes, because there are other differences, but this sort of trench warfare with drones that no one expected. It must also be said, if the Russians have made mistakes, and they have, the Ukrainians and NATO haven't just made mistakes, they haven't gotten a single thing right. Quite a difference. In other words, they haven't gotten a single thing right. Once the war has started,
there's one thing NATO supporters do very well, and above all the current authorities of the US Armed Forces. The Minister of Defense, now Minister of War, Secretary of War, can't do anything militarily, absolutely nothing. But what they can do is marketing. Let's look at the images distributed by the forces themselves, by Pete Hegseth himself, the US Secretary of War and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. Images released a few days ago from his visit. Pay attention. The contrast with Gerasimov reading a paper with that face. What is this? Pete Hegseth in Top Gun, dear Fernando. Pete Hegseth at the Pilot Training Academy, known as Top Gun, from that fantastic movie starring Tom Cruise in 1984. There's an F-18, right? His family is there.
Not
that fantastic. They could have spent more money because the enemy fighters, I can't remember if they were Soviet or whatever, were F-5s painted to look like, no, I mean, damn, seriously, they really could have done better.
Now, what a bunch of shameless people. Here they introduce Pete Hegseth with this shot.
I'm sure it's not him.
Maybe so, but in the back seat, as if he showed up piloting.
And he was probably dizzy, but since he's wearing sunglasses, you can't tell at all.
I was surprised that when he came down, he didn't regurgitate anything, no vomiting, but maybe that's edited too. And his family waiting. Attention. Now this could very well be, Fernando, this is super appealing, this could be marketing. Attention to the family waiting. Do you remember this scene, Fernando, from Top Gun? When Tom Cruise, flying over the base, calls the control tower and requests permission for a low pass. And the controller answers, right? In some way. And then he appears flying, and the other one, scared, with coffee spilled everywhere, and the music. This is literally the same control tower. These ones might still manage. Militarily, they can't do anything anymore. Between corruption, the multinational super-profit model, obesity problems, drug addiction among their soldiers, the disaster of a political command completely in crisis. Well, like the United States. But these ones might still manage. There he descends. Maybe that's a lie too. And the family with their little guns.
Americans love this. The family, the kids, the woman who goes there to pour water for the dad. Americans love that.
Why won't they remember that, showing this stupidity? Well, why won't they remember the families of the Gazans who were killed? That's the real problem.
Well, no, because these aren't white like those.
Kids, of course.
Sure.
Blonde little boys, Americans.
These are others, that is.
Fernando, a bit of self-promotion this Tuesday here. Oh, there we are in front. This Tuesday here in Buenos Aires, the gathering with the demolishers, with the followers of the channel, Tuesday at 7 p.m. at El Pulqui Bar, 484 Entre Rios Avenue, here in the federal capital, in the city of Buenos Aires. As on so many other occasions, here in Buenos Aires, in Bogotá, as so many times in Madrid, together with Fernando and Juan Antonio Aguilar, we're going to hold a meeting with the demolishers over a beer, a glass of wine, a coffee, a tea, whatever each person prefers, to deliberate on geopolitics and international politics. Everyone's invited. Free admission, of course. So everyone's invited to this. Fernando.
Y bueno, esto, aprovechar, yo quiero decir que
Will this take advantage? No, I mean, let's see. What I want to say is that all of you who are there in person should take the chance to ask him questions live and face-to-face, tough ones. I mean, make him sweat a bit. And above all, get him to tell you things that can't be said here because, well, you know, the algorithm is watching us. And Ezequiel can tell you those things there in person. And it's kind of a record opportunity to take advantage of. I mean, if I were there, I'd already be going, even just as a listener, you know, to have him tell me things.
Fernando, how about in the last 15 minutes? Because in 7 minutes, by the way, the polls close here in Argentina, and we want to present something about that. We join a broadcast with Professor the Rey in a bit. The last 5 minutes of this broadcast, a little faster than usual, about the situation at the front, with the encirclement in Pokrovsk, and so on. What's the situation there, dear Fernando?
Well, a disaster for the Ukrainians as expected, and it's going to be an even bigger disaster when winter comes. Right now, a disaster. That is, it's critical. Pokrovsk is already doomed. There's no debate here. It's doomed because all the roads have been cut off, and practically half of the city of Pokrovsk has been taken. As I said, they have no way out except across open fields. In practice, they're encircled. Well, across open fields, but with drones. I mean, they're swarming around there, so they'll catch you, no doubt. And that's about 5,000 to 5,500 trapped. There it is. And this is going to be the great disaster because, let's not forget, it's the place where they've deployed more and more troops to defend themselves. And to put an end to that, if we remember, I think it was at the beginning of August, that advance to the north they made from the northern part of Pokrovsk. Well, in smoothing out that sort of strip, the Russians occupied to the north, and in holding Pokrovsk, they used everything they had. And well, that's what caused the inevitable to be delayed. And now it's here. The distance, I think, from here to that city that's already been taken, Rodinsky, or whatever it's called, that one's already taken, well, the distance from here is about 5 or 6 kilometers, just to give us an idea. So this is already the great disaster. We already knew for a few days that they were withdrawing from Mirnorad, which is the city parallel to Pokrovsk. Units were pulling out. This one's been taken, right, Fernando? It's already taken, and yeah, everything's moving very fast. And from here to the area controlled by the Russians in Pokrovsk, it's about 5 or 6 kilometers, more or less. 5 or 6 kilometers without good roads. In fact, I think this road here, the secondary one we see, they've advanced southward and it's already cut off. So it'll be even less. And from there on, they don't have any roads, good or bad, secondary or otherwise. That's why they're practically encircled. And that's where the so-called ultimatum comes from. Either they surrender or they're finished. Now, this doesn't mean it's going to fall tomorrow, because we know there are units still fighting, and they'll keep resisting to the end. Well, it'll have to be cleared out, taken bit by bit, but it's already decided. Up north, in Kupiansk, it's the same story. What they're telling us, Kupiansk, both the eastern and western parts of the city, is practically taken by the Russians. And there's effectively a pocketed area because the river is behind it. In other words, in this area here, well, we have the river. All the bridges in Kupiansk are already taken, and the ones that were on the Oskol River, further south, have been destroyed by the Ukrainians. They keep trying to set up pontoon bridges again and again in Othisianir, but they don't last even a day, because as soon as they put them up, the Russians bomb them. So a very serious situation. Another 5,000 or so trapped there, with no way to get out of that pocket created by the capture of the western part of Kupiansk, and because they have the river behind them, at their backs, and no bridges.
porque tienen el río detrás a sus espaldas y no tienen puentes. Así de claro. Es decir,
That's how it is, plain and simple. In other words, this is settled, case closed. Let's move on to other places. Look at Lyman. Just a few weeks ago, they were still relatively far away, in quotes. Now they're already on the outskirts, already in the suburbs, already in the Dasha areas. The thing is, Lyman will take longer. Lyman is a relatively large city, and although it would be the third capture of Lyman, meaning Lyman was in Ukrainian hands, then the Russians took it, then the Ukrainians retook it, and now the Russians would take it again. It's a city of some size, even though it's quite destroyed, and well, it will take more time. But those are already there. At the same time, further down, Siversk. Siversk, once they cut the road that connects Siversk directly with Lyman, it's over. That's it, it's over. There you have it. They're already practically surrounded in Siversk too. This is happening here. Another one that's going to fall. Further south, Kupiansk. In Kupiansk, they've also entered, finally, definitively, although there's still a lot of work to do, but they've already entered the city, including the Dasha areas, the outskirts, the first streets. But there's still work to be done there, because they've moved in through a kind of rapid advance. And, well, and then before I forget, watch out for Juliaipolo. Guliaipol is getting worse and worse. I mean, the Russians have practically destroyed everything there. Only Uspanivka remains, which is the last one, but they're going to take it soon. It's the last village in a belt, they had around Guliaipole. Well, they're advancing here too. In fact, they're advancing along the entire front line. But further south, there's the line on the border between Dnipro and Zaporizhia. They're advancing quickly here, and this is heading toward Prokropske, not to be confused with Prokros. Prokropske is a strategic crossroads that, among other things, supplies Guliapol from the north. Well, with that, they're going to finish quickly because it's moving very fast. They're advancing in Dnipropetrovsk, in that area of Dnipropetrovsk, and further south, right, where the Russian flag is there. Well, further south, see? Uspanivka. So they're going to take this in no time, and from there they'll have already taken the whole belt of small villages, which were also, I can't remember the name of the river, protected by a river, and open fields toward Guliaipol. Then, Guliaipole is another place that's in a very complicated situation.
No, Yanchul is the name of the river, apparently.
That Yanchul is just one of those things. Anyway, you could call it Rio de la Plata, Rio Ebro, I don't know, something pronounceable. But well, even Orahov is being attacked, and they're having to bring in reserves if they can.
How many Ukrainian units are encircled, in your opinion, Fernando, right now between Kupiansk and Pokrovsk?
Well, according to what's been said and what people are reporting, around 10,000, 11,000, give or take. That's quite a lot, right? I mean, well, no, if we're talking about armies of hundreds of thousands, then yes, relatively speaking. But still, it's a significant number, because let's not forget, most of those who are encircled are combat units. That is, in most modern armies, only a minority of soldiers actually fight. The majority are dedicated to other tasks, mainly logistics. So what we're saying is that they're mostly encircling attack units, that is, direct combat units, which tend to be the most experienced.
So this is a disaster. Yes. Here, for example, in Kupiansk, according to this map, and for me it's one of the most serious mappers, the conservative one, but better that way actually, regarding brigades, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 practically encircled. And yet, barely, in quotes, about 5,000 soldiers encircled, more or less. A brigade should have between 3,000 and 5,000 troops, roughly. Obviously, if the real number is 5,000, these brigades are extremely under strength. as a result of the losses they've suffered. Because if these brigades appeared in full, at full strength, we would be counting many more soldiers, indeed.
Utilizaríamos muchos más soldados.
Claro, efectivamente. Es decir, si cogiéramos todas las brigadas que...
That is to say, if we took all the brigades that make up the Ukrainian army and counted them as if they were at full strength, they would have an army that's, I don't know, absurdly large. What we're actually seeing is that these units are very incomplete, and many of them don't even reach half strength. In other words, we're not talking about full brigades, but about half a brigade and sometimes less. Of course, otherwise I could say I'm the 340th Brigade. But in the end, how many men do I have? No, I have 1,000, maybe 1,200. Because they're very worn down, because they often can't replace their losses, can't rotate, and above all, they don't have enough capacity to fill the gaps left by casualties. That's a problem that's been around since last year.
Ese es un problema que viene ya desde el año pasado.
Yes, lamenting. Bild's military expert, the most anti-Russian and pro-NATO tabloid in all of Germany, the country's highest circulation publication, something like the British Sun, a sensationalist tabloid, but with huge reach. This is their military expert, very, very popular. And he himself, despite his contempt for Russia, made this post. This is the current situation around the Ukrainian cities of Pokrovsk and Minorad, which previously had 105,000 inhabitants.
Before the war.
Before the war. From the Ukrainian perspective, I see several political reasons to keep the area semi-closed. Militarily and logistically, it's a nightmare. Politically, to understand the maintenance. Militarily, this is a nightmare. And that despite their pro-Ukrainian stance, their anti-Russian position, their contempt for Russia. And here, showing 14 kilometers. Bye.
Come on. What a joker. What a joker. And if I go even farther, even more miles away, what a joker this guy is. I mean, of course, instead of taking the closest distances, no, I'll go over here. Well, that's very typical of DeVille. But let me be suspicious for a moment. What a coincidence that, while the disaster in Pokrovsk is unfolding these past few days, Zelensky isn't in Ukraine. Coincidences? Coincidences? Come on, just to avoid taking the blame. In other words, to avoid owning the disaster, let others deal with it. I don't know. That's what I think. And he's out there on tour around Europe, fooling around.
Dear Fernando, let's wrap things up slowly once again. Let's remember, please, the invitation for this Tuesday at 7 p.m. at El Pulqui Bar in the city of Buenos Aires, Entre Rios 484, just a few steps from the National Congress. Everyone's invited, free of charge, to the Demolishers gathering. So everyone's invited. By the way, join us on DMP Geopolitics, on our Demolishing Political Myths channel in English. The same one, with Fernando speaking spectacular English, thanks to artificial intelligence. Because otherwise, no. And well, please remember to help us with a thumbs up, and in half an hour we'll be back here with a special broadcast.
All right then, make it really short like this. What do the polls say more or less?
Well, the polling stations have just closed. The election is over. I haven't seen anything published yet. But according to all the previous polls, they all predict a poor result for Milei, and even the possibility of a disastrous one. For me, this marks the beginning of the end of the Milei experiment. Yesterday, we presented it in a broadcast dedicated to this. Fernando, this is the end of the madness. Regarding Milei, unfortunately, we still lack a consolidated alternative project to counter this. But well, sometimes we must first bring about the destruction of what is bad, before we can begin building what is good. That's the goal now. For this disgraceful person to step down from leading the destiny of the nation. Or at least my nation. Dear Fernando, as always, a pleasure. Your closing remarks, whatever you like, but please make it quick. Well, let's see. I wanted to start by saying when I was born, in my first days. Also, in a bit, Santiago Martinez, I also need to prepare right away the cover for his previous program.
Vale, venga, va. Pues eso. Que seguiremos hablando.
All right, okay, fine. That's it. We'll keep talking. See you on Wednesday. We'll talk about a lot of things. We'll talk about the Chinese. The Americans have once again bowed their heads, making a reverence to the Chinese over that weird strip issue, and they're making deals and backing down. We'll talk about the Chinese, the Americans, how things are progressing in Russia, which is moving faster and faster, about the winter awaiting the Ukrainians, about the de-electrification. Anyway, plenty to talk about. So stop bothering me, and I'll let you go.
Adrián Pulido, thank you very much for joining us. Demolidores and demolidoras, a hug. Fernando, bye-bye. See you later.
Hasta luego. Yeah.